Tonight is a fun class. Typically, we tend to think of chronology as something that is dry and slow, meticulous and boring. Oh, thanks, Jeff. All right, fantastic. I'm going to just dig right in tonight because, you know, once you have all that dry, meticulous and boring data, it's what you find in that data that really makes it come alive. And in this particular class tonight, it is Israel's history that is informed on the data of the Jubilees. So this is going to be just a lot of fun as we go through and we see the role that the holy days played in ancient Israel's history and how it informs on our understanding of what occurred and the stories that we read in scripture. So tonight we are on, and I'm just going to give you guys the page numbers that we're working on. Let me come back here to mine. We're on 366 to page 385. And what we see is that at Sinai, God established and if you read in Leviticus 23, he established holy days that were to be the sign of his covenant with Israel. This included the weekly Sabbath. It included a release year every 7 years. The seventh release year was both agricultural and economic. Debts were forgiven, and then you had the land laying fallow. Following the land means that you did not harvest any of your crops. You did not plant anything that came up on the soil. You know, you could eat whatever self-reproduced or was generated on its own, but you didn't have a formal harvest. You really kind of tilled everything under. You put those nutrients back into the soil. In fact, scripture even states you're supposed to allow your cattle to roam your fields and basically to fertilize it for that year every 7 years. Now, in the 50th Jubilee, it occurred for 2 years. You would have 2 years that the land would lay fallow, and you would not plant or have any formal harvest. Now, this is where it gets interesting because a lot of the events that we read about in scripture are not just everyday events. They actually happen to coincide, or they are occasioned because Israel is already coming to convene at the capital city. Now, Israel had, during its time on the land, whether we look at the Judges era, throughout the monarchy, there were 3 capital cities in Israel's history. So let me go through this real quick. The first one, when Israel entered the land, their capital city was at Shiloh, and this is where Israel would convene for their holy days. This occurred until Samuel's day, when the Philistines confiscated the Ark of the Covenant in battle, and then it existed at a temporary location. During this time that the ark was not at Shiloh, when it was at a temporary dwelling, Israel resorted to Mizpah on the country's northeastern interior. They did this simply because it was a place of safety. The southern regions were being accosted by the Philistines, and there simply was no safe location for the nation to meet for the annual holy days anyplace south. As we come into the monarchy, David firmly establishes Jerusalem as Israel's capital city, and it remains Israel's capital city until the nation's fall. So Mizpah only really had about maybe a 30-year service where it served as the nation's capital. But when we read the stories in history, the scribes are not, they kind of assume that you know that these are when Israel is meeting. And so they don't say, hey, you know, this was the 10th Jubilee, this was the 49th release year. They don't give you any of that information, and you have to really glean it from the text. So that's what we're going to see tonight. So one of the most important Jubilees that occurred in Israel's history was the Jubilee that occurred in Hezekiah's 14th year. Now, I've referred to having anchor days, kind of benchmarks where it helps us reconstruct Israel's history both forward and backward. Hezekiah's 14th year actually does this. And it's fascinating because, and let me read to you, and I'm actually getting ahead of myself a little bit tonight because I find this information so fascinating. I'm just wanting to jump right in. So let's go back. I'm going to take us back before we get into Hezekiah's Jubilee too deeply here. Let's look at the statutes that establish this precedent. First of all, you find in Deuteronomy 31, 10 through 11, this is what it said. This is what it says. And Moses commanded Israel, saying, at the end of every 7 years, in the year of solemnity of the year of release, and the feast of tabernacles, when all Israel is to come appear before Yahweh your God in the place he shall choose, you shall read this law before Israel in their hearing. So what we find is that every 7 years, Israel would come and they would convene at a capital city, the place where Yahweh had set his name. And at this reading of Israel's law, the nation would reaffirm or recommit to the law for another 7 years. But there was this built-in mechanism for these congressional assemblies where the entire nation had fellowship, they had unity, incredible brotherhood in these at these times. You also find that Israel in the book of Joshua met, at least there are 5 different occasions that are mentioned in the book of Joshua where Israel convened at Shiloh. And this is something that scholars speculate, but they really don't have anything firmly to go off of, because honestly, I have not seen any scholars attempt to reconstruct Israel's jubilees in a very comprehensive fashion that is meaningful for the events that we read about in Scripture, but we're going to see some of those tonight. What we find in Hezekiah's 14th year is that Isaiah tells us that the land remained fallow at that time. And let's read this. This is going to be Isaiah 37, verses 30 through 32. This is what it says. It says, and this shall be a sign to you. You shall eat this year as such as grows of itself. And the second year, that which springs forth of the same. And then the third year, you shall reap and plant vineyards and eat the fruit of it. So in a normal release year, you would only have one of these years. It would say, you shall eat that which grows of itself, and in the second year you should plant. But that's not what this says. It says in the first year, just eat whatever the land produces, don't sow. In the second year, just eat again whatever springs forth from the land. Don't harvest, don't sow. But then in the third year, that is when you sow and when you will harvest at the end of that, well, during that third year. So this lets us know very clearly that the 14th year of Hezekiah was a release year, because it states that this was in the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign. Now, fascinatingly, and I say absolutely fascinatingly, Scripture is not the only source that we have for this. When Sennacherib accosted, remember, this was a time of war, incredible conflict for both the northern and southern kingdoms. Sargon had begun a campaign of sieging Samaria. Samaria had fallen to his son Sennacherib. Sennacherib had deported Samaria during this time. What we also find is that Hezekiah may have made an alliance with the Levant, the nations around the Levant, and with Egypt. And there may have been some sort of resistance in that region to Assyria's aggression within the land. We know that Sennacherib sieged Lachish, that he deported 250,000 people from Jerusalem's outlying territories. So Jerusalem was also assaulted in these attacks, or at least their territory was. But what's interesting in this, when Sennacherib assaulted Azekah, which was a city kind of on Judah's borderlands, we have an inscription by Sennacherib that states that he had attacked, he had accosted Hezekiah during Hezekiah's 7th time. Now, the inscription is very broken, it's very fragmented, so we don't have a lot of context. So, of course, the less information you have, the greater the theories and the greater the possibilities of what that may mean. So some scholars, such as William Shea, say, well, this refers to the weekly Shabbat. You know, I have a hard time finding that one weekly Shabbat, even though it is the 7th day of the week, would be distinguished from any other weekly Shabbat in the course of a year. But the fact that if it refers to Hezekiah's 7th time being a year of release. And we know from scripture that nothing was sown or planted. This is the perfect opportunity for Sennacherib to come in and to accost Jerusalem. Food stores would be running low. You siege the city. The walled areas have no crops that they are producing that they are going to be able to support their citizens, which means you're going to have starvation, you're going to have dysentery, you're going to have all sorts of diseases set in that will weaken the population and force them to surrender. So this is just a perfect opportunity for Sennacherib. Now we know in scripture that Isaiah prophesies that Sennacherib would hear a rumor in his own land, he would return, and that he would be slaughtered in his own temple. From Assyrian inscriptions, we know that this actually happened. It was a number of years later. Yes, Sennacherib did retreat to Assyria during Hezekiah's 14th year, but his death actually occurred sometime later. It just wasn't in that year, but it did prevent Sennacherib from coming and accosting Jerusalem again. So that's just some interesting trivia there. Now, what's fascinating, and let's read about the Jubilee also in Leviticus, because Leviticus 25 deals with the Jubilee more than any other statute or any other section of scripture. And this is what Leviticus 25 verse 11 states. It says, "A Jubilee shall be in the 50th year be to you. You shall not sow, neither reap that which grows of itself, nor gather the grapes from it in your undressed vine." So there's, again, this idea that the land lays fallow. During a normal sabbatical year, crops would be planted in the fall or winter of the 6th year and harvested in the spring of the 7th, although no spring or summer sowing would take place. Consequently, this meant that no fall harvest or sowing occurred in the winter of the 7th year, and certainly no harvest in the 8th year. So if you look at page 368, I have the 7th year release. I'm a little dry tonight. Bear with me here. On page 368, on table 9.7, I have what it looks like that Israel would have, a table that shows how Israel would have followed the land for the 7th release year. Then on page 369, we have the following of the land for 2 years. And if you look at that table, you will see there was 2 years of following, and then in the 3rd year they planted. So the following of the land did not actually begin in the spring. It actually began in the fall, and then the harvest resumed in the spring, simply because crops were always planted in the fall and harvested in the spring. So that's naturally what dictates the cycle. Now, as we find Hezekiah's 14th year and we identify it chronologically as a Jubilee year, this means that as we go forward in Judah's history, every 50 years forward, we're going to have a Jubilee. So what is fascinating in Israel's history is that we find, what does Jeremiah do during the twilight years during Zedekiah's reign? Well, we find that Jeremiah brings all the elders together, and he asks them to release their Hebrew slaves, because there was some, the implication there is that only very recently in Judah's history had Judah declined from observing the release year and releasing their Hebrew slaves. So Jeremiah is really trying to mount this incredible revolution, this incredible patriotism to come back to the covenant, to come back to the Torah, and to once again follow these release and Jubilee years. So in the 4th year of Zedekiah, and you can look at this on page 891 at the very end of the book, you find that Jeremiah is encouraging all the elders of Jerusalem to release their Hebrew slaves. But he wasn't just asking them to release the Hebrew slaves and just because it was some year and that it needed to be done. He actually encouraged them to do this during Zedekiah's 4th year, which was a release year. So when you see the correspondence to the Jubilees in Israel's history, it really makes scripture come alive when you are reading these stories. So let's look at some other Jubilees in Israel's history that really make this study quite fascinating. We find that when we go back in Israel's history, we find that King Solomon's temple, when he began construction on the temple and when he dedicated the temple, those both transpired. The breaking ground on the temple occurred during the Feast of Sukkot on a release year. The temple was dedicated 7 years later, also on a release year. And this is something that, you know, scholars actually do accept, and it is something that has been written about in academic literature, because you have the 7-year period between 890 and then it's finished in 973. So it's very fascinating when you follow this chronology and you see the importance that both the release and Jubilee years played in Israel's history. As a matter of fact, this is one of the only references that we have to Israel observing, specifically mentioning the Feast of Tabernacles was at the dedication of Solomon's temple. But this doesn't mean that we don't have other inferences at other points in Scripture, because we actually do. We find that when we look at Israel's history, we find that when we go back, we find that King David was actually, remember, he reigned over Judah for 7 years, and then he reigned over the United Kingdom of Israel for 7 years. David was established on the throne at 7-year intervals because that is when Israel convened. So he began his reign over the United Monarchy in 1016. He began his reign over simply Judah 7 years earlier in 1023. So when you see this pattern consistently throughout Israel's history, you see the incredible importance these release years actually played. And that, guess what? Contrary to a lot of the noise that you hear out there, Israel actually observed the covenant. And this is actually supported by statements made of David that that no one kept the Torah like unto David. And as a matter of fact, you had this formula that the scribes used, where David and his adherence to the Constitution, to the Torah Constitution, actually established a standard by which all other monarchs in Israel's history, especially in Judah's history, were measured. It will say he did that which was right, like unto David his father, or he did not do that which was right, like David his father. And oftentimes you find that this very formalized statement was often entered into the register during a Jubilee year, because it was the Jubilee when writing took place, when the updating of administrative documents took place. It wasn't just always on a day-to-day basis. They were very specific points in time when this activity occurred. So when we go back in Israel's history beyond David, we find that Israel asked for a king at Mizpah. They asked for a king during a release year. Samuel sends them away. And when you first read the books of Samuel, you know, chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10, those books of First Samuel, it seems kind of contradictory with just a cursory reading when you read the accounts of Saul being anointed as Israel's king, because in one instance he hides among the baggage, in another instance Samuel tells him to go search for his father's asses. He tells them where they are, that they've been found, and then Saul begins to prophesy. So when you read these accounts, you think, well, my goodness, there is some contradiction here. And then you get scholars who then say, well, you know, this was the J author, this was the Elohist author. So you have those contradicting theories. But all of those contradictions are smoothed out when you realize that there is an elapse of period of time of 7 years. You have one convening of Israel at Mizpah. 7 years later, you have another convening where Saul is actually anointed and he formally begins his reign. So when you take those into account, it really informs on Israel's history and makes them a lot more understandable. Going back in Israel's history, we find that, let me see which one I want to cover here. A very important, the Jubilee, Israel's 10th Jubilee. and occurred during King David's reign. So this would have marked Israel's 500 years on the Promised Land. And what did David do to commemorate this event? Well, in the 49th year of the Jubilee cycle, David begins the process of bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. And this would have been right around 1008 BCE. So this would have been about 7 or 8 years after he had ruled over a united kingdom. He begins in the 49th year to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. We remember Uzzah tries to study the Ark. There's a breach, and David ceases because he doesn't know what the problem is. He doesn't know if he sinned, if the congregation has sinned, or if it's just Uzzah. So he seeks God. He seeks an answer, and he returns to the Torah to realize that a lot of the protocols with removing the ark and transporting it had not been followed. So then you find a year later, during the Jubilee year, David actually brings the Ark of the Covenant with all the proper regulations, brings it into a temporary tabernacle that he has erected at Mount Zion, and establishes the Ark of the Covenant there. So there was a reason, you know, that what we read about in Scripture, David wasn't just doing this on a whim. There was a very significant national holiday that occasioned David's celebrations and the bringing of the Ark into Jerusalem. Going back, we find that there was Elon was installed as a judge during the Jubilee in 1108. And what is fascinating in this account, then this would have been Israel's 8th Jubilee. And let me just make this correction because there is an error on page 372. If you look about, a quarter of the way down the page, the very first paragraph that begins, the 10th Jubilee occurred in 1108, that is an error. It should read the 8th Jubilee occurred in 1108. So during this Jubilee, Elon was established as a judge in Israel's history. And this would have been over a united kingdom. You know, you did have some division a little bit between the north and the south, but that breach that occurred during Rehoboam had not really yet occurred yet. So what you find is that during this time, you had Elon, who was leading Israel, but you also had Samuel at its side. It's during this time period, it is stated in 1 Samuel 6 and 7 that Samuel himself reclaimed like 22 cities, and he took them from the Philistines under his leadership. So there is some indication that Elon and Samuel would have worked together, fighting Israel's battles and reestablishing Israel's border and chasing the Philistines out of the land. This is why I think it is so hurtful, and why Samuel takes it so personally when Israel asks for a king, because he had been very successful in his campaign against the Philistines. You know, yes, his sons were at home manning the fort, and they were basically stealing from the people. There was a lot of corruption, a lot of bribery that was occurring at home. But on the battlefront, Samuel was making the nation safe by warring and reconquering the land that had been lost by the Philistine invasion. So I think this was why we get from the text, you know, how Samuel, it really touched his heart. And it was very painful and very hurtful with what Israel said. And then that's where you see God coming in and saying, Samuel, don't take this personally. They're not rejecting you. They're really rejecting me. So God kind of comes up and stands up for Samuel in many ways. And you can see how, you know, God is really sheltering Samuel in that instance. Now, as we go back in Israel's history, we read in Judges 5 of Deborah and her scribes. That the scribes from Zebulun, really the scribes from all over the nation, come and they meet together under Deborah's administration, and they write. And, you know, Deborah talks about the pen of the scribe, and there's a few, and we're going to really save more of this material for chapter 11. But there's a lot of inferences in Judges 5 and 6 of a codification, of an updating of Israel's scriptures that occur during her administration. But these were just ordinary years, just the run of the mill, uh, days in Israel. Israel had the opportunity to do this, the writing, the scribal activities, to come together and convene, because a 50th Jubilee occurred during Deborah's administration. So the nation would have come together for the Feast of Tabernacles. There would have been great joy and celebration. And that is what gave the occasion for the writing of scripture and the updating of the nation's archives. So going back, we really don't have any significant jubilees until we come to a very important and very sad one. And that would be the 6th Jubilee on the Promised Land, that occurred shortly after Joshua's death, Joshua and the elders that outlived him. So this would have been roughly about 42 years after Israel is on the land. Remember that Joshua was very old when he died, about 115 years of age. And both an account in the last chapter of Joshua and the first chapter of Judges states that Israel followed the Torah all the days of Joshua and the days of the elders that outlived him. So within 42 years, we find that Israel rebels. They no longer adhere to the covenant. They start making alliances. They start making treaties with the very people God told them to drive off the land. And it is at Bochum, which is a play on the word for Shechem, because Shechem, and let me just diverge here for a moment. Shechem you can think of as a capital city per se, but not the exact district. So you had the broader city of Shechem, and within Shechem you have Shiloh, the same way that later on you would have Jerusalem, and then with Jerusalem you would have Mount Zion within that capital city, the Migdal within that territory, which was the holy precincts of the temple. You have the same type of scenario at Shiloh, Shechem. So you have Bochum as a word play on Shechem. And here you have a breach of the covenant. And in Israel's early history on the land, right as Israel is fixing to come into the land, Joshua has this messenger that comes to him, and he meets him with the sword. And Joshua says, "Are you for us or against him?" And this guy says, "No, neither. I am with the armies of God." So you have this being a Melech that appears to Joshua and talks about victory and things that he must do. Well, you find the same messenger appears to Israel at Bochum, and he says, "You have breached the covenant of Jehovah, your God, and he is no longer going to fight your battles for you." So up until this time, the first 42 years Israel had on the promised land, you find that God had intervened in very magnificent ways to allow Israel to inherit the land. We're going to see some of those ways, and they're not some mystical or magical interventions. They are actually something that was very logical, and you just had other armies from other nations that were actually active in the territory and kind of created a vacuum. But we'll see that again in chapter 11. But for the point of this discussion, the 6th release year is very important because it marked the end of the progress that Israel had on the promised land. It marked the end of God fighting on Israel's behalf. So and this breach of the covenant occurred in 1466 BCE. So if you will turn to page 374, you will see all of these jubilees and the significant release years listed on this chart, and you can see how it really informs on Israel's history and really makes it come alive. You will also see that the first 5 release years on the promised land are actually alluded to within the book of Joshua. For instance, Joshua 23 and 24 refers to 1 release year. You find anytime you see a national activity, whether it is the dividing of the land among the tribes, or the nation convenes to, hear some case or something like that, anytime you see those activities in scripture, they almost always occur during either a release or jubilee year. And as a matter of fact, this is not the only reference. We find in 2nd Chronicles 15:12 through 15, under King Asa, we find that during the 12th Jubilee, Judah convenes and they reaffirm the covenant. They actually recovenant with Jehovah during the reign of King Asa, which would have been the 12th Jubilee of the nation. So again, you really have to kind of put these together with the evidence that's there and match them up, and it really does come alive. So just going back, you find Joshua 13 probably mentions the 2nd release year on the land. This would have marked 14 years for Israel to be on the land. Joshua 21 would have been the 3rd release year. Joshua 24, and perhaps may overlap Judges 1, because a lot of the terminology that's used between the last chapter of Joshua and the first chapter of Judges, they really overlap each other, as though a scribe is writing an ending of one book and the beginning of another, probably, the hand of the same scribe. So it's very possible that they both refer to this 4th release year. And it's funny because scholars do actually admit in a lot of academic journals and in dealing with chronology that Judges 23 and 24 do probably refer to release years when Israel would have convened at Shiloh, because we do actually have mention of Israel coming to Shiloh in these texts. So that is something that's very important when you're looking at chronology and you're looking at Israel's history, and you see that, oh my, indeed, Israel was at one time a Torah observant nation. And then when you read the prophets talk about how Israel was at one time a righteous nation, and it says that light dwelled in them and that they were the envy and the glory of all nations, you can see from the text that what they are saying is true, because at one time Israel did indeed follow their constitution, and it gave them great joy. So I invite everyone to really look at the table on it's table 9.11 on page 374. It really makes that history come alive, and these days are kind of renewed again during the Second Temple period. We're not going to look at them now. We're going to really save that for when we look at the testimony in part 2 of Yahweh Exists, the volume 1. And we're going to see how important the Jubilees and the 7 times play in Israel's history. So the Jubilees were simply a naturally forming chronology. It was not that they predicted anything as far as prophecy is concerned. It wasn't that they were important as far as determining anything in Israel's future. It was just simply that they were naturally recurring times of celebration, times of national conventions, where national policy, where people automatically came, so they naturally give rise to that type of history within the Tanakh when you read it. Now, this is totally different from the covenant that Israel made with God. And we're going to go back a little bit in time, because when Israel convened at Sinai, God gave them a formal testimony within the covenant that he made with them. And you find that the word for covenant and the word for testimony are really interchangeable. When the testimony is put into the Ark of the Covenant, it becomes the Ark of the Testimony. And as we discussed a couple classes ago, the testimony was specifically, it had the formal covenant, which was the historical prologue, the introduction, the preamble. You had the stipulations, the requirements, the sign, and the consequences for breach of pact. Now, what you find when this reference to the testimony is made by the prophets or throughout the Tanakh, it often refers specifically to Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 through 30, which were the breach of pact stipulations for Israel's covenant. And what these were not just some, this is going to happen to you way out in left field. These were specific judgments that God said he would apply to Israel to limit the wickedness they could do on his land. And these were more prophetic. They were something that was more, the limits of God's judgments were predetermined. Israel's actions were not. So there is a difference there. Hold on here. So you find that the curse of 7 times in Leviticus 26 defines 7 times by which God would place that particular curse on Israel's people, on her land, or her territory. And the 7 times specifically refer to a 70-year period. So there are 5 specific 70-year periods, and you can follow along with this on page 376. This is table 9.12. There are 5 periods of 7 times for Israel's history. Now, in the beginning, when these first 7 times begin to occur, they aren't applied to Judah. Israel rebels first, and these 7 times fall predominantly on Samaria and on Ephraim. Samaria really receives the blunt and the blow of Leviticus 26. As we get into studying the testimony in section 2, we will see that the chronology of these 7 times, that the curses that are listed in those 7 times occur during that 70-time period, and they are precise in the way that they flow and the way that they occur. They really don't occur in other periods. Now, some of them are cumulative, meaning that what occurs in one 70-year period may continue to occur in subsequent periods, but you do not find, for instance, in the part, like in the second 7 times, it talks about your heaven becoming as brass and your earth as iron, which refers to incredible famine that the land of Israel would experience. Well, we happen to find that that particular 7 times directly corresponds to Ahab and Elijah, when you have the most notorious famines occurring in Samaria and in Israel. Judah does not experience these famines. Judah is really protected, and the invasions by Assyria target the northern kingdom first, and Judah is really sheltered. So in many ways, the 7 times of Leviticus 26 are a line of Samaria. They are a measuring line by which God measures the sin of the city, and if the sin of the region is grievous enough, he will apply the next 70 years of consequence. Now, it's fascinating because scripture actually refers in 2 Kings 21:13. Let me read this to you. This is speaking of Jerusalem, specifically referring to Judah. And this is what it says. I'm going to be again in 2 Kings chapter 12. It says, "Therefore, thus saith Yahweh, God of Israel, behold, I am bringing such an evil upon Jerusalem and Judah, that whoever hears of it, both his ears shall tingle. And I will stretch over Jerusalem the line of Samaria and the plummet of the house of Ahab, and I will wipe Jerusalem as a man wipes a dish, and wiping it and turning it upside down." Now, it's very fascinating with this, because most people who will look at this will say, well, what in the world does the house of Ahab have to do with Judah and Jerusalem? Ahab ruled Samaria. Ahab and his house were totally extinguished by Jehu when he came in, and there was this coup, and he came in, very early in Israel's history. Let me get the exact date here. It would have been, let me look this up really quick. Bear with me. Let me get this. Okay, so this would have been right around 870 BCE. So very early in Israel's history, Ahab and his entire line, it says, "Him that pisseth against the wall, him will I cut off." But Ahab's house actually survived through an only daughter who married a king in Jerusalem. So Athaliah married Jehoram, and they had children. And all of their children actually retained Ahab's house. So you find that Ahab's house, a cursed house, entered into the sure house of David at this time. Joash was a descendant of Ahab. Ahab was his grandfather. So you find that this plays as a very important factor in Israel's history, because you have this sure house of of David being corrupted by the wickedness of the house of Ahab. And this is something that we're going to see when we look at the testimonial law has important consequences for Israel as far as prophecy and as far as the children's ability to and their desire to adhere to Torah. So this line of Samaria is the idea that these 7 times, Samaria was destroyed. It no longer existed. So when Samaria ceased to exist as a people, Judah inherited that measuring line of 70 years. So Judah had 70 years until 587 BCE to establish righteousness on the land. This is why you see Jeremiah is so adamant about releasing Hebrew slaves, because he knows if Judah does not return to the covenant during this 70-year period, it's all she wrote. It's history, because the testimony had foretold the consequences for breach of pact that Yahuwah would place on Jerusalem and on the people of Israel. So this line of Samaria again is 70 years, and we have some parallels to these 70 years throughout Israel's history. Isaiah talks about 70 years until Ephraim is not a people. Well, we find that Isaiah knows this because they are already 5 years into a 70-year cycle. Jeremiah also prophesies that there would be 70 years by which the land would enjoy her Sabbaths. And it's quite fascinating when you follow the chronology, which we do have. If you look at because I do have this on here. If you look on page 380, you find, and page 379, you find that the beginning of the second temple. So Israel, the temple was destroyed in 587, and you find that the ground was broken. The foundation for the second temple was laid exactly 70 years later in 517 BCE. So there indeed was this 70-year period where Israel did not have this formal capital city that really signified their independence and their autonomy and their ability to fully adhere to the Tanakh in every respect. But it's fascinating when you go through this, and I encourage everyone to look at table 9.14. You will see how this judgment of 7 times is applied to Israel in their history throughout their time on the land. You find that there are 5 times, and each time you find that statements are made within this time period stating that Israel had departed from the way of Yahuwah, stating that they had rebelled, and that is given as justification for Yahuwah to righteously apply the curses of that particular 7 times on Israel's land. You also find this idea of the kings revolting, and that when they revolt against the covenant, that is always noted because that affects the people of Israel. Sometimes the people of Israel were judged by the rulers that ruled over them, and that plays an important part. So I really encourage everybody to look at this and see how the understanding of 7 times really enlightens your understanding of Israel's chronology of prophecy. When you get into the Second Temple period, Daniel talks about there will be a period of 7 years for them to sanctify the most holy and for them to renew the covenant, to sanctify the covenant. So you find that when Israel first comes back to the land, from the point that the Second Temple is rebuilt and dedicated in 515 BCE, Israel has 70 years to sanctify Yahuwah, to walk in his ways, to make Torah the law of the land. And if they don't do that within this 70-year period, then there is this judgment that was written from Mount Sinai, written on the plains of Moab, that would be applied to the nation of Israel within the promised land for their declining from the law. And you find that it didn't occur right away, but it began to occur when these 350 years, because remember, there's 5 70-year periods. So 350 years later is right around 165 BCE. And we find that some of the worst persecutions, some of the most hideous and heinous crimes against the Jews and against Jerusalem and the temple and the rending of the veil, all of that begin to occur when this limit of cultic judgment expires. And the people then begin to receive the consequences of departing from the way of Yahovah. So we're going to look at more at that in detail next in a couple months from now, because it is a few months off until we get to that aspect of the testimony and of prophecy. But I do want to establish that there, because when you deal with chronology and you see how the chronology is reflected in Israel's history, it makes the entire story come alive. It tells a story that you may not have seen by just reading the text, without understanding that God himself had established all of these systems which functioned in the background, even though they may not always be stated in the text, but they are referred to. So that ends our class for tonight. Next week, we're going to get into the patriarchs, look at their chronology, and we're going to also be looking at some of the different calendar issues. You know, we're coming right into Pesach, so we're right at the perfect time for examining the calendar, for seeing how the holy days inform Israel's history and how they function in the monarchy period. So I think we're going to have fun with next class. We're going to look a little bit more in depth at the building of Solomon's temple. And also, we're going to see how Shalmaneser, there is an inscription by Shalmaneser that gives us an 18-year period that between Ahab and Jehu. And this inscription perfectly corresponds to the chronology that we have in the Tanakh. So when you look at this history and you see that Israel's history does not contradict, but it is supported by extra biblical sources, guess what? It comes alive and it really supports the validity of Israel's history as we have it today. So at this point, I'm going to open it up for questions. I invite each of you to any comments or questions, please post them. I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Again, I do enjoy this topic. It just makes scripture come alive, and I just find it very enjoyable. So do you guys have any comments or questions? It's great to see you all tonight. I hope you've had a great week. I had a very busy week. We went to Texas and saw so much flooding. I can't tell you, I have never seen so much water over probably 20-mile period on range on one side of Monroe and another 10-mile range on another side of Monroe. It was just a whole lot of water. Roaring rapids right underneath bridges for miles and miles. So feel for the people in those cities. So okay, your page numbers are different. Okay, next week, and I am going to be posting an updated chronology or an updated reading schedule. I did not get to that this week. So next week we will go to page, and I'll give you for the next 2 weeks. So for April 1st, we're going to go 380 to 398, and then April 18th, we're going to go 398 to 428, and then we will take a break on April 15th for the United Israel World Union Conference. And I hope all of you guys can join us for that. It is in Charlotte, North Carolina. We usually have about 100 people show up. And this year, the keynote speaker is going to be a very well-known archaeologist who has done amazing work inside the Holy Land, and somebody who you will not want to miss. So I'm looking forward to it. And you know, I just really encourage you to come if you can. I know Sue and Horace usually come, and I hope you guys are coming this year. Give you the titles for what in particular, Betty? Yes, fastest hour of the week. Well, and this was a fast class because I didn't want to go too far ahead. You know, sometimes we go over this is a little bit shorter this week. So makes up for some of those late nights that we've had when we've had technical difficulties. The titles in the book that we're going to be starting on page 380 next week under Patriarchal Narratives, Linear Chronology. And then next week we will end on page 398, where we come to the heir apparent. So yes, so that will be our page 380 to page 398. And then for the for April 18th, is that right? I guess that is right. Hold on, let me look at my calendar real quick. Yes, because we have April 1st and then April 8th. So April 8th, we will actually finish the chronology chapter on April 8th, have the bye week April 15th, and when we come back, we get to dig into the Exodus and see some of the archaeological facts, some of the historical facts that you really aren't exposed to in any academic literature. And most apologetics are really tied to other conventions, and because of that, they really miss some of the tad bits of reconstruction that we have when we stick strictly with the Torah as the basis of our reconstruction. So yes, great, Ramon, Joanne. The conference is going to be April 15th through 17th, Charlotte, North Carolina. You can look at my Facebook page on for Jodell Onstott, and you will see I have the conference information posted. And yes, the conference will be live streamed. You know, some years we do have a little bit of trouble with the live streaming, but it is usually live streamed through Roots of Faith. So you'll get to see everybody there. It'll be the closest thing that you can to being there if you can't get there physically. So I look forward to seeing all of you guys tomorrow morning at Roots of Faith. Oh, so glad you were here, Martin. You continue to be in our thoughts and our prayers. And I hope we can catch up and you can give us an update in the upcoming weeks. I know we all think about you. And anyways, so have a great evening. Shabbat Shalom. And love you guys. We will see you next week. Same time, same place. Shabbat Shalom.